The stranger started to walk closer to Kang Hu. He was a tall, muscular guy. He was wearing a black t-shirt, blue jeans, leather jacket and gloves. His hair was dark and he was holding a modern axe. He called him low-ranking trash. Kang Hu noticed that the guy had a red mark above his head, and he was surrounded by a scarlet aura. This hunter is in a contract on Constellation. Kang Hu wonders what his power is. He looked at the approaching figure incredulously, a drop of sweat running down his face. A system window appeared above the stranger's head, skillful connector. Neutral-leaning constellation. A constellation with the ability to track mana. He looked at Kang Hu with a cheeky look of interest, one eyebrow raised upwards and a smirk on his lips. Kang Hu placed one hand on the ground, releasing an aura of blue mana. The ability to track mana. So that's how he found Kang Hu so easily. The hero grinned and smirked contentedly, saying this turned out great. The stranger asked rudely and incomprehensibly what he meant. Kang Hu carefully looked at the constellation this guy's in a contract with, and the red mark above his head for a reason. Kang Hu once again looked at the system window with a smirk and excitement at the constellation information of the stranger. A new system window appeared. Third, by killing another hunter, you are able to loot them of their contracted constellation. The stranger continued to smile cheekily and stare at Kang Hu while he looked at the red mark above his head. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of Kang Hu's face. You are able to loot this target. He grinned enthusiastically. After all, this is a chance to use constellation loot for the first time. They were facing each other at a distance of 3 meters. Around them was nothing but rock, grass, piles of stones, and loose earth. But if he's made a contract with a constellation, he's probably at least level 100. Kang Hu needs to avoid a head-to-head fight. Kang Hu instantly jumped out of his seat, running away to the side. So he wants to draw him in and attack instead. The stranger rolled his eyes and said with a sneer that he was really low-ranking trash. He put his palm above his head for a better view. He continued to smirk, telling Kang Hu to try his best to hide. The guy's eyes began to glow blue, turning into an infrared camera. Only instead of measuring temperature, he was measuring the concentration of mana in the surroundings. Before his eyes the world was colored in shades of blue, and the outlines of trees were outlined in green. He walked along the forest path, occasionally turning his head for a better view. He looked over every scrap of land, every tree. He chuckled and wondered where he was hiding when suddenly he saw a red trail to his right. His eyes filled even more with blue light. He reacted instantly. One of the trees in the trunk changed color from blue to yellow and red. His ability gave off a mana concentration warning. He gave a sly smirk, saying that he had found it. He threw several hand axes powerfully, running closer to the tree, leaves and grass flying to the sides. He cut the tree in half, leaving only a thin stump. The stranger was puzzled when he realized that there was no one behind the tree. He irritably called Kang Hu a rat and asked where he had gone. A moment later, he froze in a mute scream as his throat was pierced by a sharp sword blade. He couldn't make a single sound, only a muffled wheeze. Kang Hu kneeled in front of him, holding the hilt of his sword with both hands. The guy started to try to cough, but he couldn't. Blood oozed from his throat, dripping onto the forest path. Kang Hu grinned at him, saying how stupid it was a proximity dealer would just throw his weapon away. Scarlet blood flowed down the blade of the sword, reaching its hilt. The stranger's eyes were becoming glassy. Kang Hu said that it was his own fault. He shouldn't have looked down at his opponent. His face was indifferent. He mercilessly twitched the knife to the side, leaving the guy no chance of life. Crimson streams began to flow from his neck. The hunter's body fell breathlessly on his back. The stranger's last memory would be the cold-blooded face of Kang Hu. A system window appeared. You have killed the target and seized his contract with skillful connector. Kang Hu looked calm, though he was breathing tiredly, while he was reading the next system window carefully. Skillful connector is under the control of Dimension Looter and is unable to escape outside of extinction or termination of the contract. There were 3 system windows in front of him now. One of them was character information, and the remaining 2 were about his abilities. A new system window appeared and announced, all of Skillful Connector's abilities have been transferred to you. Kang Hu thoughtfully looked at the information about him while wiping the blood from his face with his hand. He scrolled down to the ability section below, where 2 abilities appeared, both of which were at the maximum level, mana tracking ability and night vision. He continued to flip through the rest of his information. Kang Hu was pleased with himself and the fact that he had managed to get the stranger's contract. He decided to check the mana tracking himself, his pupils and iris filled with blue light. He looked around. All objects were displayed in blue with a green outline. There were no red or yellow signals, so there are no more pursuers nearby. Suddenly, Kang Hu felt a sudden loss of strength and nausea. He covered his mouth with the palm of his hand in case he felt that he was about to vomit, but he realized that it was useless to hold back his vomiting. He rested his sword on the ground and crouched down, coughing and panting. He began to vomit blood clots. Perhaps he had exerted himself too much and his body couldn't take it. He tried to catch his breath. He was dizzy. He was almost faint. Kang Hu looked at his palm, which had bloodstains on it. His face began to pale. To hide his marks from the enemy, he suppressed his mana hypersensitivity, hiding behind a tree. When the pursuer passed by, Kang Hu found a very ordinary cobblestone and poured all his mana into it, causing thick veins to appear on the guy's hand at that moment. The stone began to turn blue, glowing, and if he left it as it was, the explosion would suck out all the surrounding mana, like near a mine reservoir. So he had to immediately suppress his mana hypersensitivity state and throw the rock away. He then strained hard so that the ability wouldn't work. Sweat even ran down his face, and the rock flew and stuck into the tree that the stranger had chopped with his axes. Thanks to this, he successfully lured the enemy out and was able to kill him, but in order to quickly approach him, Kang Hu had to use short-distance leap, which helped him move around, but due to the lack of mana, the ability caused Kang Hu's body to be in such a pitiful state of exhaustion. His head felt as if it was splitting. A violent migraine came over him in a wave. He tried to restrain himself from screaming by biting his lower lip. If he pushes himself anymore, he'd just straight up die here. The sun was already starting to rise. Kang Hu needed to find a secluded and safe place. He slowly walked on the cold ground, trying not to faint. Kang Hu passaged near a cliff that had a highway next to it. He turned his attention to it and looked down tiredly. A truck was passing by carrying sand meant for cleaning main stones. Kang Hu scattered as far as his condition allowed him and jumped off the cliff, trying to land directly into the back of the truck. He managed to jump to it by standing on the sand with his feet. He looked up at the morning sky. The clouds were colored in warm shades of orange and the sky above was already blue. He tiredly laid down with his back on the sand, running his hand through his disheveled and messy hair. Kang, who had killed 3 guards during his escape, this was not in the novel. He moved, leaning his back against the wall of the truck. He needs to make sure that the future doesn't change while he's still getting stronger, so that he can use what he knows. He figured that, given his insignificant position in this world, the future shouldn't change somehow. He had bags under his eyes from lack of sleep and rest, and his face was indifferent on one side and miserable on the other. The truck passed near forests, mountains and the sea. Kang Hu smiled relaxedly for the first time in a long time as he looked at the seascape. The morning seascape was incredibly beautiful and calm. The dawn sky, colored in shades of pink and orange, is reflected on the water surface. The morning seascape is full of mysticism and inspiration. Just one look at it makes you forget your worries and immerse yourself in the world of silence and beauty. A building showed up. Perhaps it belonged to the government or other high-ranking services. The man with a cigarette in his teeth was talking about how they could just find new low-ranking rookies to mine Mona stones so they had nothing to worry about. He ordered someone to get back to work. The subordinate took his order and walked out the door, closing it. The man with the cigarette was dressed in a strict suit and a dark coat. He had a small beard and short sideburns. He was looking thoughtfully out the window. The man smirked and said that Kang Hu was a pretty smart kid, to think he'd catch us off guard and confidently leave through the front gate. At this time, Kang Hu himself was walking into a blue phone booth and across from him was an overturned white car in the crosswalk. He was breathing heavily and struggling to hold onto the walls of the booth to keep from falling. Because of excessive usage of mana, his stamina isn't recovering easily. He began to dial a number with bloody and dirty fingers. Meanwhile, the high-ranking man continued to think about Kang Hu. So a level 10 assassin class whose residents can't even be found killed a level 45 and a level 55 with a constellation. Kang Hu's top secret file was on his desk. Kang Hu reached someone at that time. He said hello and introduced himself. The girl on the other end of the line answered, calling him by name. Kang Hu said he was across the street from Dijin Station. He asked if his conversation partner could do him a favor. The man with the cigarette at this time laughed and said that this will be a fun hunt. At this time, Kang-hoo was visiting his friend Seo-yeon. Her room had light-colored wallpaper and had various shelves of books. Kang-hoo thanked Seo-yeon for treating him when he asked her out of the blue. The girl carefully bandaged Kang-hoo's body with bandages and asked what happened to him and if he was in a war zone. Kang-hoo said that the eclipse had kidnapped him. The girl was dumbfounded as she pressed her lips together, and after a moment, she asked Kang-hoo if he had been pulled into a mine of mana stones. She noted that the organization was known for kidnapping hunters. Hing was an incredibly beautiful yet strong girl. She had short gray hair and her eyes were a light blue. She had a strong build and broad shoulders, her entire body covered in old scars. She was wearing a gray t-shirt and short blue shorts. Kang-hoo had told her that the workers themselves needed mana to mine mana stones, so low-level hunters like Kang-hoo would quickly become prey to the other hunters. Kang-hoo's gaze became serious and cold. Even though he could fall prey to the hunters, he could trust Seo-yeon and contacted her because she still loves Kang-hoo. Seo-yeon grabbed her head and started sobbing while whispering apologies to Kang-hoo. The girl's face was covered in a blush and she herself couldn't hold back her tears. She said that if she had kept in touch with Kang-hoo after what had happened between them, he wouldn't have had to go through all that horror. At the time of their breakup, she was a newbie hunter who had recently awakened. Though right now, she's a level 150 veteran in a contract with the Constellation. Kang-hoo looked at the girl who was crying bitterly and saw a red mark above her head, indicating a constellation. If she had been with him back then, she would have been dragged to the Chongyang Detention Center as well. Kang-hoo tiredly closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead in exhaustion. The bandaged Kang-hoo started to get up from the floor, telling the girl that that's enough caring from her and nothing good will come out of getting involved with him. How? The clips might even track her. Seo-yeon tried to change his mind and keep the guy for a little longer. She said that she was now at level 150, a level where ordinary hunters could no longer treat her so carelessly. Kang-hoo coldly said that she didn't need to worry about him so much. He smiled and said that she should only use this power for herself. Seo-yeon remained silent at these words. Kang-hoo was about to leave Seo-yeon's apartment. She prepared a set of freshly washed clothes for him and told him that she had put him enough money in a formatted smartphone. It wasn't supposed to be traceable. Kang-hoo told her that it looks like her guild is dipping its toes in a somewhat gray border. That's right, back then and even now a guild suits her. He remembered the moment they had broken up, when Seo-yeon looked much smaller and had long hair, while Kang-hoo's appearance hadn't changed since then. Seo-yeon embarrassedly folded her palms on her chest and asked if Kang-hoo wanted to join her guild. She said very softly that they could be together again like they once were in the past. Kang-hoo interrupted her by calling her by name. He looked at her detachedly and coldly even though he was grateful for her help. He softened a little and told her not to stay trapped in the past. He pulled his hand back, asking her to gesture for it to stop. Seo-yeon's large blue eyes began to fill with tears and her lips twitched. She lowered her head, her face flushed again, and a tear ran down her cheek. She smiled slightly and then agreed with him. The tears continued to roll down her face. Kang, who was about to leave as Seo-yeon, told him that she took care of his request. She has a friend who is a leader. She left all the details in her phone. She looked at him responsibly and sensually and told him to take care of himself and wished him to stay healthy. Kang-hoo peacefully thanked her and told her to take care of herself too. He left the apartment and went downstairs. A gray cab was already waiting for him there. It was warm and sunny outside. Kang-hoo asked the driver to take him to Dijin Station. The mustachioed, middle-aged cab driver said he wanted to turn on the radio and asked if Kang-hoo minded. He stared blankly out the window and said he didn't mind. The cab driver turned up the volume and the news was on the radio. News has it that the Youngwood Guild has assassinated the entire White Rose Mercenary Corps. After Judgment Day, the White Rose Corps based in Jiangxian, Gangwon-do is a rapidly rising criminal organization. Kang-hoo had knowledge of Judgment Day. That day came quietly and unnoticed. All the streets were empty, and the previously vibrant neighborhoods looked abandoned. On a sunny day, a car was driving on a wide road, but there were no other cars. There was an ominous atmosphere in the air. The driver of this car, a young guy, said that today was a bit strange, because it was a day off and there was not a single car on the street. He turned to his wife, but she didn't answer him. Her face was corroded to the skull, and the remaining skin on her neck was already beginning to vaporize. All that remained of his wife was a skeleton, and his face contorted in a grimace of horror and despair. The Dark Reaper appeared in front of him, already pointing his scythe at the guy's neck. He let out a piercing scream of fear and pain. More and more Dark Reapers swooped down on their car. A reporter was broadcasting from the scene of action. She was standing on the roof of a building in Seoul's Gangnam neighborhood. She was reporting that the sky was colored a dark purple hue and it could be seen even from a long distance. Hence the early reports that there were monsters in the area. She didn't have time to finish the last sentence, because something with green scales that resembled a dragon grabbed her and ate her. The green monster began to slide down the wall closer to the streets, where other monsters resembling spiders and wolves were devouring the citizens. Monsters of unknown identity. Dungeons covered with strange skies. In the middle of this mayhem, the ones who acquired powers are now called hunters. People tried to hide in fear on the roofs of high-rise buildings, but the monsters could get there too. The only ones who could help them were hunters, who killed monsters and beasts. This inexplicable situation led people to believe divine judgment had fallen. The city was in shambles, buildings and cars were on fire, and the roads were littered with abandoned cars of citizens trying to escape the nightmare. The hunters who originally hunted monsters began to hunt people. Many people could be seen chopping monsters to pieces with their swords. Among them were dragons, giant snakes, and werewolves. At first, the hunters killed people in the name of the gods, but later they started to do it for no reason. The demented guy stood with a ghastly smile while the bodies of a dozen innocent citizens lay behind him. A girl whose face was all abrasions and whose clothes were stained was running away from someone. She stopped when she realized there was nowhere else to run. She was breathing heavily, trying to regain her breathing rhythm. She stood fearfully near the wall as a crowd of unscrupulous hunters approached her. One of them said someone thought he was harassing her. He came closer to her with sword in hand and told her not to worry, for after one blow it would be over painlessly. He swung the sword, but at that moment someone stopped the blade with his white gloved palm. It was covered in blood, but the savior asked the girl if she was okay. As the story nears its end, the savior of the world Jiang Xiwan appears. He was the one who had stopped the hunters who were about to harm the girl. The hem of his robe glistened, and he looked like a saint who had come down from heaven. Centered in Seoul, he created the helper, the protector, and the healer of the people, the Manhwa Guild. The light and warm energy emanated from his hand, as if it was trying to heal and protect the girl. Jiang Xiwan smiled blissfully as he looked serenely at her. This is why everyone is eager to get to such a supposedly safe soul. Kang-Hu continued to ride in the cab and stared blankly out the window. The radio said that the White Rose Corps had been long tracked down by hunter Jiang Xiwan for plotting a terror attack at Exit 11 of Gangnam Station in Seoul. The bags under Kang-Hu's eyes were very bright and a faint smile appeared on his face. At this time, his cab driver was happily surprised that an entire terrorist organization had been eliminated, and then he exclaimed that he didn't expect anything else from Xiaohuan. The driver looked at Shin through his rear-view mirror, keeping a parallel eye on the road. The White Rose Corps were not a terrorist organization, according to Kang-Hu. Of course, they didn't stage terrorist attacks among other things. It was all planned by Sichuan. The cab driver asked Sichuan if him being a Korean hunter was a matter of great pride. Kang-Hu took out his smartphone and started looking at something on it, and the cab driver went on to tell him that his son had recently awakened his powers too and his dream was to join Sichuan's guild. Kang-Hu realized that if he went against Sichuan by telling the whole truth about him, he would turn Kang-Hu into a villain in the eyes of the people. And the outcome of that is clear as day. Kang-Hu remembered the crowd asking to finish him off in the novella. He imagined them standing back to back with Jiang Xiwan, but only Jiang Xiwan was illuminated by a bright light and Kang-Hu was in his shadow. He was reading something on his smartphone as he passed by the skyscrapers. He asked Seo Yun for a favor to be introduced to the mercenary squad because the other guilds might be within his reach. The driver said that they had arrived. Outside the window were high-rise apartment complexes, offices, and highways. Kang-Hu was a bit worried, however being a mercenary who gets a job exclusively from the mercenary squad was the best option for him. A girl in gray clothes extended her hand to him and said hello. She said she heard about No from Seo Yun. She introduced herself, her name was Irin. She was a tall and slender girl with long brown hair. Irin was wearing an open-shouldered top and leather pants, and on her feet she had high-heeled boots. In her hands, she was holding a folder of documents. Kang-Hu didn't need to introduce himself by his real name, so he called himself Sun Kai-woo and extended his hand to the girl in return. They shook hands and Yiren said it was nice to meet you. She started rummaging through a folder looking for the right paper, saying that she had a great job as a collector for him. Kang-woo said seriously, he's not suited for such a thing. He needs a job with good pay and she can give him challenging tasks first. Yiren stopped digging through the folder and said puzzled that she definitely heard that the guy is only at level 10. He calmly confirmed this information and the girl started giggling quietly in response, but soon she couldn't stand it anymore and started laughing loudly without even being embarrassed. She even had a tear spill out from laughing, which she wiped away with the words that Kang-woo is just ridiculous. They say that being too bold is reckless bragging. She became serious and detached in the same second. Yiren's body and face became covered in a green aura and she asked if he wanted her to clean up after him afterward with the remnants of his dead body. Kang-woo smiled excitedly and asked if having skills was the most important thing in mercenary work despite the level of the person. It seemed strange for Kang-woo to meet the character he had carefully and painstakingly created. A red constellation mark appeared above her head, and a system window appeared next to it. Observer of Chaos, Neutral-leaning constellation. A constellation with the ability to distort and block sight. Yiren was a mage and protector who had a contract with an above-average constellation. She was created by him to oppose the 13 stars in Sichuan. He visualized in his mind the majestic image of Sichuan surrounded by bright red stars, and in front of him stood life surrounded by a bright green aura. Kang-woo realized that he had to gain her trust first. He tried to gather his thoughts, his face seemed calm but also a little worried. Yiren continued to emit a dark green aura as the guy told her that only abilities and skills were needed, regardless of your level. He asked her if she was a mercenary herself. Yiren tiredly exhaled, covered her eyes and respectfully said that reality and spirit are different things. She lowered her head, realizing that he was saying the right things, but she couldn't be completely sure of him. Kang, who walked past Lai, who stood with an emotionless expression, and replied that prejudice and truth are also different things. She smiled faintly and hummed. Yiren turned to him and smiled mischievously, putting on the glasses she had previously had on like a headband. She agreed and said that he should show her the skills then. They stood opposite each other at a distance of 10 meters near a glass building. Yiren began to concentrate the energy sphere of green energy in her right hand and said that she would judge exactly one thing, whether he could dodge her attack. Green light covered her body and a green haze began to ooze out from the sphere. She was smiling slightly evilly, but she wasn't going to seriously harm the guy. Kang-woo stood relaxed, he too was affected by her green light. He said that she wanted to see if he could at least protect his body. Yiren replied in the affirmative and said that the evasion skill can create the possibility of a retaliatory attack. Kang-woo got into a fighting stance, preparing to attack. He covered his face with his hand because the light was too bright. He realized that that's creating puppets using fog and being able to track even in faraway places. Fog trackers. A fantastic and mystical elven woman appeared out of the green haze and fog. Kang-woo started to look at her and thought that it's not an attack skill, so he won't die even if he gets hit, but if he can't dodge, traces will remain, so the test will end immediately. Kang-woo shouted loudly that it's time to start, putting her fist to her chest, to which Yiren excitedly replied that she was starting. The first green elf puppet flew towards Kang-woo, followed by a soft green trail. The puppet was moving extremely fast, however, Kang-woo himself was in no hurry to move. He was ready to dodge at any second, but he was waiting for the right moment. Kang-woo saw that they were only centimeters away from colliding, and then his silhouette was illuminated by a green haze and a translucent glow. Yiren stood there in incomprehension as to what had just happened. However, she turned around and shockingly looked at Kang-woo, who was vigorously running along the glass wall of the multi-story building. She watched in amazement as he slid down the glass. She thought that this makes no sense. At this level, even jumping a meter would be hard. He's proficient in using the assassin's basic skill short-distance leap. Yiren couldn't believe that a level 10 hunter could use his skills so proficiently. She smirked a little wickedly. After all, he wasn't just idly bragging. She released a second puppet that flew straight towards the wall towards Kang-woo. She wondered with excitement if he would be able to dodge this time as well. The green puppet flew lightning fast, leaving behind a small shockwave. Yiren's hair began to develop in the wind. She controlled the flight trajectory of the puppet, which flew right within an inch of the glass walls. She noticed that Kang-woo changed the trajectory of running along the wall, so the puppet followed right behind him. Kang-hoo anxiously turned around, after which he smirked contentedly. He saw that the puppet was about to fly over and touch Kang-hoo, but he managed to teleport back a couple of centimeters, thus avoiding the collision. The puppet vaporized, releasing a huge amount of green energy. Irin watched all of this from the ground, not realizing how he was doing it. She turned away slightly so that she wouldn't get hit much by the shockwave, but it still disturbed her, causing Yiren to growl softly. She looked up again with an astonished expression. Kang-hoo ducked again. Her gray eyes were open in surprise, and her thick black lashes rose up. She wondered what not to mention, just earlier, that traverse teleportation. While Yiren was trying to see the guy in her green haze, Kang-hoo had already teleported behind her back and drew his sword. He coldly leaned the blade against her neck. Irin worriedly shifted her gaze to him. Kang, who calmly suggested to end the test at this point, Irin looked at him a bit fearfully, but realized that no harm would come to him. She hummed and stepped aside. Kang, who thought that she was faster than he expected, so she was a mercenary commander for a reason. He frowned slightly and a drop of sweat ran down his face. Irin tried to make a calm face, but she couldn't help but be intimidated by the fact that a rookie could move like that. She asked if Kang-hoo had practiced before. He continued to hold the blade at her neck and replied that he hadn't practiced before. Irin moved the blade away from her face with 2 fingers, smiling widely. She said that these movements were not something that a level 10 assassin could repeat. Kang-hoo asked a little anxiously if he passed the test, to which Irin smiled and replied that he had passed and she could give him tasks that were meant for level 50 people. Kang-hoo started to put his sword away in his scabbard. He said that it was good. He was looking somewhere in the distance. The sky was bright blue, although it was a bit cloudy. Irin and Kang-hoo were driving together in a minivan through a neighborhood that looked destroyed. She was driving in the front seat, and the guy was sitting in the back looking out the window thoughtfully. Irin looked at him through the rearview mirror and grinned. She happily asked him if Kang-hoo was interested in bulletproof glass. She said there was a shooter recently who gave her some trouble. Kang-hoo expressionlessly asked to clarify which shooter she was talking about. Irin laughed good-naturedly while holding her face with one hand. She said that she had recently received a lot of attention and love from the Eclipse people. Kang-hoo looked at her tiredly and irritatedly and thought that there was a turf war between them. She summoned her green elf girl to get a roll of paper. Irin said it was in order to track a wanted criminal. The elfess handed the piece of paper to Kang-hoo, a little embarrassed. Then Irin added that she herself was the customer and this order would be quite useful to him. He read what was in the contents of the order. Vion-i-do Province, Austin City. Open Dungeon Abandoned Ruins. Mukhayan, Level 50, Mage. Request to retrieve 3rd rank item Vartaros' shoes. It was a semi-abandoned town and the target was a marginal-looking man who looked like a homeless man. Kang-hoo read it carefully, paying attention to every word. There was a little pixie hovering on a piece of paper, watching Kang-hoo. The guy asked if he should be taken out alive. Irin smiled good-naturedly, saying that he might as well kill him. Mukhayan has killed too many civilians. He can execute him on spot, and the Hunter National Security will like it too. Kang-hoo grinned and exclaimed that he was ready to execute him right now. He arrived in Austin. The city was dusty and dilapidated. The buildings looked like they could collapse right now. He walked along the deserted road all alone. Irin had told him a few hours ago that Mukhayan was most likely hiding somewhere in the corners, so finding him would not be an easy task as the place was not small. Kang-hoo walked past empty houses with broken windows, buildings with collapsed roofs and toppled signs. This was not a bad starting dungeon for Kang-hoo. This place had been used as a hideout for Kang-hoo in the novella, so he was quite familiar with it. Also, there were some pretty useful medium difficulty bosses here. He walked through the empty streets with confidence, looking straight ahead of him at the stretching roads. Kang-hoo had changed his weapon. It was now more like Kang-hoo's weapon in the novella. It was a huge knife. Behind the ruins sat white rabbits with red eyes. Kang-hoo noticed them, glanced in their direction and said that he had finally found them. Kang-hoo slashed his palm with the knife. Blood started to flow from there. The rabbits paid attention to him. The flowing blood had a special effect on these rabbits, making them aggressive and bloodthirsty. They started screaming with their thin voices, showing their fangs and releasing their giant claws. They instantly rushed towards Kang-hoo. The guy first used traverse teleportation, avoiding the rabbit's attack, and then he used short-distance leap to leap forward, with which he cut the rabbit in half. He repeated these moves over and over again, cutting all the rabbits. He cut each of them in half, their small carcasses beginning to fall onto the road with a quiet thud. Kong, whose reflexes were at their best, he didn't miss a single hit. He was able to dodge and kill the rabbits. Not a single muscle on his face trembled during the battle. He remained cool-headed and calculated his every action. He walked away from the scene of the battle. Rin had also told him to retrieve the commission item before completing the task, and then he can do whatever he wants with the rest. He stood near the canopy of the building where the boss appeared, dressed in rags and holding 2 blades, one in each hand. Yiren asked what he wanted as a reward. Kanghu said that all he needs is to receive a dungeon raid license for those with many middle and last bosses. He remembered the system window that had a second task on it, get the boss ability and assign it to himself. The eyes of the ragged boss began to glow red and the rest of his face was covered by a hood and mask. Kanghu gave him a satisfied look and said, "Here comes the middle boss."